joining us today as we launch our joint report with MECOPP. It's been 30 years and nothing worthwhile has been done, a gender budgeting analysis of gypsy traveller sites in Scotland. This project aimed to explore how local and national budgets and policy decisions impact.
Sorry, Carmen, I've muted you by accident.
Okay, that's fine. I don't know where we were, but I'll introduce myself again. I was saying that my name is Carmen and I'm the Policy and Engagement Lead at the Scottish Women's Budget Group. And today I will be chairing this event. But before we begin, and while we welcome more people into the room, I will go through some brief housekeeping rules. So we'll be recording the event in full. However, only the presentations will make it to the website. And this is just to better capture all the topics that might come up during the discussions. If you could keep yourself muted, please, that would be great, as our speakers are not interrupted. Please feel free to pop your questions into the chat box as we go along, and we'll discuss them at the end during the Q&A, and you'll also have an opportunity to ask questions directly to the speakers. Keep an eye as well on the chat box for any publications. However, there's been a lastminute.com issue with the report, so we might need to follow up with an email. Bear with us. So that's the housekeeping done. Without further ado, I'll introduce our first speaker, Cherise Barclay-Daly. Cherise started with MECOPP 3.5 years ago as their community health manager. And this last year, Cherise has taken on the role of service lead for all MECOPP Gypsy traveller services to cover sabbatical, and she refers to this as a welcome challenge. Cherise will provide an introduction to MECOPP, the organisation and the work that they do. So Cherise, if you are ready, we'd love to hear from you.
Hello everyone, and thank you for your time this morning. It's great to actually see so many faces and so many people that I know. For those of you that I don't know, I'm sure my narrative will be welcomed. And for those that have heard it 100 times, I hope it's not too tiresome. I'd like to thank Scottish Women's Budget Group for giving us the opportunity to be here today, and of course for the opportunity to work alongside them on this piece of great partnership work. My colleague Sherelle is our Women's Voices worker, and I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank her and let you know that I'm only stepping in for her today because bless her, she's off this week. So I can't take any of the credit for this work, and I hope I do it justice just chatting alongside about this. For those of you that don't know MECOPP or the service, I am literally just going to give a 5-minute introduction to our service. Next slide, please, Carmen. Sorry.
I think it's Heather sharing the presentation. Heather, if you could
sorry, yeah, I've moved it. Is it not moving on? No.
No.
Ah, wonderful. Hold on. Right, let's try again. Do you know, I love it when the IT works.
I'm just grateful it's not me.
Mode, Heather. So there we go.
Thank you. Okay, so MECOPP itself is a minority ethnic carers organisation first and foremost. MECOPP has been established for coming up 26 years now. We pride ourselves on the services in which we work on and contribute to. A big part of the work that MECOPP has provided these last 15 years or so has actually been around Gypsy traveller community. Arguably, it's got bigger and bigger and bigger, which is wonderful. And we became a bit of a one-stop shop, which is obviously working for the community and around current themes and needs. So in terms of this, you can see that we work particularly with Gypsy Traveller communities. That is national around Scotland. And when we talk about working with Gypsy Travellers, it's Gypsy Travellers who identify themselves as Gypsy Travellers. And it's Gypsy Travellers living in houses, roadside, local authority sites or private sites. And if we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. This gives you a bit of an indication of the services in which we have right now. These services remain fluid in terms of need and, of course, funding. You can see that it looks like quite a lot of services that we have just now, but these are imperative to the work that we do. We have our services around community health workers, capacity building, counselling and wellbeing services, caseworker services with targeted pieces of work around accommodation and housing. And we have our policy officer and rights development worker alongside engagement for men and food insecurity. So you can see it's quite a well-rounded service overall that we actually we have and we've developed. A lot of our services are very much asset-based. We have developed and encompass an asset-based approach where we have Gypsy Travellers themselves working in positions where they are liaising with the community, and it makes absolute sense. A really nice example of this is our community health worker piece of work that is currently ongoing. For those of you that want to know a wee bit more about that, you'll find it on our website. We've got our finalised document, evaluation document from Dundee University. That's live just now. But in short, I guess my rationale for showing this today was none of these services are basically standalone. They can't stand alone because everything is attached, you know, that whole correlation between health and home. Something that came up really evidently and early on within our community health worker programme was the fact that when community health workers were first coming across members of the community with issues, the majority of these issues were around accommodation and home. You know, where people's health was absolutely being impacted by the state of their accommodation, or that it wasn't fit for needs, or for instance, somebody who was having to move out of their accommodation because of their physical health. Another woman who came to us in financial difficulty because she was living in a caravan at that point on a site, and unfortunately she was also using a dialysis machine that was to be plugged in for 24 hours a day. So what I'm trying to do is just give you a little flavour and put a bit of meat about the bones into the kind of context of this, but to show that I guess when community health workers have been in post for a few months, they were actually saying, we get it now. You know, as members of the community and as professionals, you know, it is that correlation between health and home and how everything kind of ties in. This also really works as well, of course, because in terms of the services that we use, there is a natural referral process, not only within MECOPP, of course, because the last thing we want to do is sort of ring fence anyone. It's not about that. And it's about us incorporating other services in with the community and doing those introductions. Next slide, please. In terms of today's topic around the Scottish Women's Budget Group and around accommodation and housing, I've intentionally popped this slide in today because I guess from our point of view, we are in a really unique position. And although being in third sector, particularly at this time, guys, and those of you that are in third sector will see where I'm coming from in terms of funding and that real genuine insecurity around that. Third sector, however, does give us that really sort of ambiguous position where we're in and amongst it. And I'm really grateful to have that where people can speak that wee bit more candidly and passionately, and we have a wee bit more flexibility, I would argue, as well. I think this time for me, certainly my 3.5 years of being with MECOPP, I've been able to experience what I feel is a real shift, a real culture shift, predominantly this last year, where in terms of racialised inequalities, alongside the rest of my colleagues, and no doubt most of the third sector here, we have been working towards, or working around racialised inequalities. I've seen a real shift where, although we used to knock doors constantly, and ask for people to be involved and can you help and can we partner with you, we're now being asked for our client base to partner and to actively engage in a meaningful way. A couple of examples of this would be, the recent roadside stopping pilot, and to evaluate that alongside an independent consultative service. The recent social landlord, Scottish housing regulator, being involved in that heavily. The input in the listening exercises, which I've just popped that slide up there. Actually, this was something that Scottish Government, COSLA and MECOPP were all involved in heavily over the summer, where we had a minimum of 10 listening exercises nationally for people, as in the Gypsy travelling community, to be involved in. We heard over 200 voices around what people wanted. And it's, I guess, a really nice example of real engagement is the evidence that was taken from these listening exercises. And of course, a lot of that was around the theme of accommodation, and housing has now been incorporated into the new community action plan. That is the standing commitment for Scottish Government and COSLA towards Gypsy travellers going forward. That's a really lovely piece of work, and know that that is now established is great, because it gives us something to reference to and of course to work towards. And of course, we've been involved in the valuation of the 20 million fund spent, which is still ongoing, that valuation. So certainly from my point of view, it's about being able to, the real changes, are around policies and making sure that they are implemented. And I guess from our perspective at a national and local level, we are now seeing Gypsy travellers' needs and wants reflected in policy. But I think as services working with people around needs, etc., we know better than most that change doesn't only happen with policy, it happens with attitudes. And for me, I feel the fact that we are now being requested in terms of our client base, I think that shows a shift in attitude and a genuine want for people to be involved, which is a wonderful start for these changes to make place. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. That was just giving an indication of what we've done in the listening exercises. I just wanted to finish off with just a couple of slides about Gypsy travellers' voices and what they said. I love this. Listen to us, to our communities, listen to our voices. It's our lived experiences, but don't just listen, act on what we say, not just ticking boxes that you've listened. I think this kind of sums up what I was trying to interpret in the last slide. Next, please. And yet, just again, on the back of that was just to say the commitment, of course, in terms of Scottish Government and COSLA going forward in Scotland as a whole. And obviously, on the back of this conversation and how we have been engaging in best practice going forward, Scottish Women's Budget Group will now take over and give an excellent example of that. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Cherise, and thank you for bringing up that talking about the policy objectives or the vision for Gypsy and Traveller communities in Scotland and what that means in practice, i.e. Implementation, which Heather is going to touch on as part of her presentation. And so Heather is our training and participation lead at the Scottish Women's Budget Group. I'm sure many in this room know her. Heather joined the group in 2020, and prior to that, she worked in the violence against women and girls sector in a variety of roles, including delivering support to women, children, and young people, and delivering training and awareness raising. Heather's presentation will focus on what we did, what we found, and recommendations for improvement. Heather, when you're ready.
Thanks, Carmen. And thanks for that, Cherise. And as I say, like you said, it's a shame that Sherelle's unwell, because we've been working on this project for probably coming up for about 18 kind of months now, in terms of kind of planning and just kind of carrying out the engagement sessions and also you know, doing the analysis that we carried out. And Sherelle's been absolutely key in terms of making those arrangements that have enabled us to speak to the women that we spoke to as part of this work. I'm just going to touch a little bit for those that maybe not heard about the Scottish Women's Budget Group or what gender budgeting is. So I'm going to just touch a little bit on that before I go into the kind of the gist of the what the research found. But gender budgeting is basically...
Heather, sorry, before you go into detail, just to say that the presentation is not coming up. I think you're trying to share the screen, but it's not coming up, sorry.
Okay, let's try again. Joyful. Okay, let's try this one. Is that working?
Yes, now that is working, thank you.
Wonderful, okay. So, yeah. So I was saying about just in terms of a little bit about gender budgeting. Gender budgeting is an approach that basically asks us to critically analyse how the way in which we raise money and how we spend money either addresses inequality or embeds and entrenches that inequality. And one of the key questions that we ask in relation to gender budgeting is about who benefits and who doesn't. And in terms of gender budgeting, we come at it initially from looking at the different needs of men and women. We take that intersectional approach, looking at how different indices in terms of people's characteristics impacts on their life chances. But in terms of some of the kind of key principles of gender budgeting, I think a couple that I'll highlight because I think they show kind of why we took the approach that we did in relation to this project. Gender budgeting is very much about increasing transparency around the decisions that get taken and about why those who take decisions make the decisions that they make. You know, one of the kind of mantras around gender budgeting is about being able to follow the money, about being able to see how money's been raised, how it's been allocated, how it's been spent, and the outcome, the impact of that. One of the things that gender budgeting is that it's outcome focused. It's about asking the question about what is the change that we're looking to achieve, and how does the way in which we raise money and spend money help us to actually do that. But gender budgeting is also about accountability. So it's about looking at actually how do we, you know, in terms of that evidence-based approach, how do we increase that transparency, and how do we increase that accountability in terms of understanding that link between the decisions that we make in relation to how we raise money and how we spend money, how that impacts on different people's lives, particularly those who experience disadvantaged. And gender budgeting is participative, so it's about ensuring that we are, involving, speaking to, listening to those who are affected by the decisions that are taken. So that kind of just lays a little kind of, I suppose, groundwork about what gender budgeting is. If anybody has any questions at the end about that, happy to cover them. But we also offer training in relation to gender budgeting approaches and how they can be used by organisations. So if anyone is interested in that at the end of this, you'll have our our contact details, so please get in touch. In terms of the approach that we took to this project, and why we kind of approached and MECOPP about doing this work, is that we know that in Scotland and internationally, that the Gypsy traveller community, that there have been long-standing human rights issues. And you know, in Scotland, when we look back, particularly since the advent of the kind of Scottish Parliament, there have been a number of pieces of work in terms of reports and inquiries that have been published, looking specifically at the needs of the Gypsy traveller community. And through this project, what we wanted to look at was about looking at actually what difference had some of those made, and how were local and national budget and policy decisions impacting. So we know that, you know, from the research that we did, and also, you know, for those that are involved in the area, that, you know, the inquiry that the Equal Opportunities Committee undertook in the first Scottish Parliament and published in 2001 was a critical moment in terms of, in Scotland, in terms of recognising the needs of the Gypsy traveller community. Excuse me. But we also know that further reviews and reports that were carried out in 2005 and 2012, 2013, and the 2017 Addressing Race Equality in Scotland report all showed that actually, despite the reports and the inquiries that had been undertaken, there had been little change for the Gypsy traveller community. So what we wanted to do within the work that we were doing with MECOPP, what we agreed was that we wanted to look at the impact that local and national budget and policy decisions were impacting, and to see if we could do that work around following the money in terms of differences and gaps in public spending, particularly around accommodation and educational needs for the Gypsy traveller community. So that was kind of what we set off doing. So we started off by going through all of these reports, seeing what they were saying, what were the kind of key moments, I suppose, in terms of some of the research and work that had been done in Scotland around the Gypsy traveller community, as I say, since 1999 and the advent of the Scottish Parliament. And as I say, it was about asking what difference have those made, and how does, as I say, the decisions that get taken around local and national budgets make in relation to making a difference. So in terms of what we did, as I said at the start, Sherelle organised engagement sessions, and we met with 39 women. So that was between kind of February and June of this year. And we had 7 sessions in 6 local authority areas. So of those, the women that we spoke to were between the ages of 16 and women in their 60s. And 21 of the women that we spoke to lived on a site. 4 were living on a decant site because their sites were being redeveloped. 3 had been decanted to houses while their sites were being redeveloped, and 11 of the women that we spoke to lived in social housing. During these kind of engagement sessions, we were, kind of speaking to the women about what their experiences were, how they felt things were, what impact these reports had had, what change they had seen, and how that was impacting on their current living conditions. In terms of the areas that we were speaking to women in, we were in Argyll and Bute, we were in North Ayrshire and Western Bartonshire, in Fife, in Edinburgh, and Falkirk / Kinnie, Clackmannanshire, we spoke to women in as well. Excuse me, a range of areas, and a range of areas where, some, as I say, for 2 of those areas, there was site redevelopment going on, and in others, one of them in Edinburgh, that site redevelopment had been completed, and in the other 3 areas, there wasn't currently any site redevelopment happening. I would say that in relation to certainly from the areas apart from Edinburgh, so even in the areas where there was redevelopment, the women that we spoke to did still raise issues about what was happening and how they were being involved and around kind of participation and things like that. And we'll look at that as we go on through the presentation this afternoon. So one of the things that came out in relation to the women that we spoke to, particularly for those who were living on sites, was that for them, a number of them felt that little had been done to improve living conditions since the sites had been opened, many of them in the 1980s, and some older than that. And the women that we spoke to reported a number of issues in relation to damp and mould, in relation to sewage, in relation to just that the amenity blocks that they were being provided weren't fit and weren't suitable for their purposes. And a number of areas, so in again, Argyll and Bute, Western Bartonshire and North Ayrshire, where they've not been selected as the pilot sites for the Scottish Government Accommodation Fund. What the women were saying was, though, that they were finding it difficult to get repairs made because they were being told, oh, we've got this money coming for redevelopment and we don't want to waste money on making major repairs to the site. And that included in one of the areas where one of the women, her child had health issues, and she was asking for repairs to be made so that it took the bath out or something to help the child to get into the bath. And that was refused on the premise that this money may be coming to redevelop the site. But from speaking to the women, what they were saying was that even before this money had come, it was difficult to get repairs made to sites, and that often when they did report things, it took either a long time or those repairs weren't made in a way that actually resolved the problem. And in terms of speaking to the women that we spoke to who were living on sites, and about the impact that damp and mould and living and the spaces that they were using, and the impact that had on them in terms of both their physical and their mental health, was quite clear to see. Quite a few of the women and their families had cold-related kind of illnesses, basically. So in terms of that health inequalities and the impact that had on them, was something that they were clear was related to their living conditions. So in terms of what Charisse was saying about what the community health workers were finding, that definitely came out of the work that we've undertaken as well. So one of the things, as I say, that we wanted to explore was around investment. So there's been lots of, as I say, action plans. There's been lots of inquiries and reports done in Scotland since 1999, looking at the issues, and all of them recommend that there was a need to improve the conditions on sites, and that there was a need to increase the number of sites and pitches as well. So we wanted to look at and see, okay, so what had led, what impact had those reports and action plans, things like that, had on actual expenditure? Because for us, we're quite clear that if, that you can have the best policy in the world, but if that doesn't make it into the budget, then actually that policy is only as good as the bit of paper that it's written on. That actually the way in which we use money is an important is important in terms of achieving the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. So we submitted freedom of information requests to the councils that we had spoken to the women in. And I think, you know, I have to say to start off with that the level of information and the quality of information that we received through this was variable. So some of the information that we got was just was completely wrong. We asked the question about what investment had there been made in sites over the last 5 years, how much of that had been funded by Scottish Government, being mindful of the fact that the Scottish Government had made £2 million available and in 2021, and how much had come from either their housing revenue account in terms of their life cycle investment programme, or other ways. And one of the questions that we also asked was whether the sites were funded through the housing revenue account or whether it was through the general fund. And all of apart from North Ayrshire and Argyll and Bute, so Argyll and Bute have, it's the ACA, the Housing Association, who are responsible for the sites. And in North Ayrshire, the site is not dealt with within the housing revenue account. But Clackmannanshire, Edinburgh, Fife, Falkirk, and Western Bartonshire, the funding was the sites are dealt with through the housing revenue account. But as I say, some of the information that we got, we know it was wrong because we had the information from COSLA about how the £2 million worth of money that had been provided by the Scottish Government had been spent. So the quality of some of the information that we got is suspect. And in terms of the report, we've put in what we know to be true from the Scottish Government. So I think the FOI information highlights that there are some data issues in terms of, so there's Western Bartonshire saying that they're not able to tell us how much was spent on the Gypsy Traveller site because their systems don't allow those separate costs to be shown. One of the things that we would be saying is that actually if we want, if accountability is important, but if we do want to show and monitor the impact that the work that's been done within the Gypsy Traveller community, then actually having systems that actually provide us with that information is important as well. So that would be one of the things that we need to be looking at. But the other thing that we wanted to identify, so back in 2015, the Scottish Housing Regulator had carried out a thematic review, and one of their recommendations was that landlords should take a asset management approach to sites in the same way as they're expected to do in relation to the other accommodation that we provided. And we wanted to try and explore, well, actually how were we monitoring whether that approach was being taken, but also to whether that approach was being taken by landlords. And I think, for a couple of them, we can say that potentially that is the case in terms of the areas where there's been investment made within the development of sites. But there were a number of the areas that we looked at where actually it wasn't possible to be able to see that any meaningful investment other than the money that had been provided directly by the Scottish Government had been made into the site. So there's a question there for us around the way in which that sites are treated and are considered, particularly within those strategic housing frameworks. So in relation to things like the housing development needs analysis, the strategic housing investment plan, and also the housing strategy. Now, while all of the all of those documents that we looked at, other than the strategic housing investment plans, mentioned the needs of the Gypsy Traveller community, the level of the information was variable in terms of actually how useful I think that will, in terms of how useful it actually is in terms of being able to see how the plan is to ensure that that progressive realisation of rights, which all housing providers have as duty bearers, is being met to the Gypsy Traveller community. And one of the things that I suppose in terms of that came up was that often I think there was a mismatch between what the women that we spoke to were saying and what we could find in strategic documents or in the information. So for instance, you know, the information the Scottish Housing Regulator holds is that all but one of the sites in Scotland meets the minimum site standards. But speaking to the women about the issues that they have in relation to, as I say, mould and damp, sewage, access to sites and ability to get on and off sites, how safe it feels for their children, really raises questions about how the way in which those minimum site standards are being used and how that self-assessment process is working. So there's a mismatch there between what the women that we spoke to, and particularly on a couple of the sites where conditions are particularly not good, that actually the self-assessment process around the minimum site standard says that they're met. So there's a bit for me about when we're talking about these standards and that assessment, how are the community and the people who live on sites actually involved in those? Because there's a bit for me where actually at the moment we have landlords marking their own homework, and that is there's a concern around that. I think the other place where there's a mismatch, and this comes up from the quote that we've shared here, is that obviously over time the nature and use of sites have changed as laws have changed, and it's made it more difficult for gypsy travellers to travel, to move about as much, to be able to use road sites and that type of thing. The nature and the use of sites have changed and have become more permanent. One of the things that a number of the women that we spoke to were really concerned about was what happens in the future. What does that mean for their children? What does that mean for their grandchildren? What does that mean for them in terms of their older age and having family there to live with and support them? And one of the things that we found was speaking to the women, those that were in houses. One of the things that I think will stay with me probably for a long, long time is that when you were speaking to them, that physical longing that they often had to be on a site, you could feel it. You know, when they were talking about it, that came across so powerfully, and the way that the women were talking about the fact that they were in homes that they didn't necessarily want to be in, that they weren't on pitches either because there was no space. So one woman had been told that she'd be dead before she would get a space on a site. Another, it was because of health issues and long-term health conditions, that being on the site wasn't suitable for her any longer. And a number of the women that we spoke to in Argyll and Bute in particular had been given lifetime, their families had been given lifetime bans from the site. So there were a number of reasons as to why individuals weren't on sites. But the information that they were given in terms of need and people that they knew in terms of their families, their kids who potentially would be wanted site pitches or want to be on sites and weren't able to, completely is at odds from what you see within the housing development needs assessment documents and within often within housing strategies. So again, there's something there about that data gathering and the way that those assessments are carried out, and how those kind of official statistics, how that the way in which we do things potentially is missing the needs of the community. And again, as I say, that idea of, you know, within kind of human rights legislation, that idea, we have a duty for that progressive realisation of rights, and that includes to culturally appropriate accommodation. So there's questions there in relation to how that is, how these strategic documents are actually showing up the needs of the community. One of the other things that we looked at was in relation to cost of living on site. So one of the women, we've got a quote there, she said to us, we pay the rent for the chalets almost the same as a 4-bed house, plus we pay for utilities direct to the council, as well as heating our trailers and vans. So as part of the freedom information request that we made, we asked councils what the rent was for a gypsy traveller site in comparison to a 1-bed property. And you can see there that for a number of local authorities that we spoke to, the rents that they were charging those who lived on sites were were higher than they were charging for permanent accommodation. Now, one of the things that we've been told is that that's because councils are using full cost recovery to cover the cost of the staff within the gypsy traveller sites. And one of the recommendations that we're making is that actually I think that needs to be looked at, particularly if the accommodation is being as part of the housing revenue account, and the quality impact of that needs to be considered, particularly given what we know about the poverty that is often experienced by or can be experienced by individuals living on sites. So that is something that really needs to be considered about the way in which the bricks and mortar accommodation that landlords have, and those equality impacts really need to be considered. The other kind of issue that came up was around kind of heating and cooking facilities, and what that means for individuals and how that impacts on their on them as well. So I mentioned earlier that a number of the individuals that we spoke to were on sites that were being redeveloped. And there was a general feeling that while there was an appreciation that the funding had been made available and that the redevelopment was happening, there was still a lot of confusion. There was a lot of people unsure about actually what the site would look like, what they would have available to them once that redevelopment had been completed. But also, a number of the women talked about how they felt that, well, they acknowledged that there had been consultation in relation to the redevelopment, that often that they felt they were treated as if they were illiterate and didn't know the needs of their community and their way of life, and that they were not listened to, and that their knowledge and experience wasn't taken on board. And a number of those on the new sites, and actually I was up in Perth yesterday for Making Rights Reels, and the travellers on the site and sites in Perth, that they have also got concerns about the ongoing upkeep and maintenance. So in Perth, for instance, they had new chalets installed 20 years ago, and because of the lack of upkeep and maintenance, there are major issues in terms of the housing conditions that individuals are living in. And that was something that the women that we spoke to reflected as well, was that, yeah, this investment's great, but actually how is that going to be maintained? So again, going back to the Scottish Housing Regulator, that asset management approach, how is that going to be actually kind of implemented going forward? And how are we going to make sure that that is being implemented? Because at the moment, the indicators that the Scottish Housing Regulator use are fairly meaningless. Landlords are asked to report on rent levels with little context around that, and they're also asked to report on satisfaction levels. And again, the way in which that works, we would contend that those indicators are something that need to be reviewed to make sure that they are adequate to show that progressive realisation of rights for the community. And in relation to redevelopment, I suppose just a couple of examples that maybe highlight some of the issues that there's been around in terms of how the needs of the community have been considered or not. So one of the women that we spoke to, she was being decanted to a property, and the initial property that she was offered was unfurnished. So nobody had thought about the fact that she was living in a trailer and she wouldn't be able to take a bed or a couch or anything with her. that hadn't crossed anybody's mind. And they had to fight to get her suitable accommodation that was furnished. And for another family with children, they were moved into a decamp property quite a distance away from the school that the children were in, and there was an expectation that the children would just be able to move school. Now, given what we know about the needs about education and children within schools from the Gypsy Traveller community, again, that lack of real kind of understanding and nuance, and actually considering the needs of the community in terms of how the redevelopment of the sites are impacting. We also asked about the future-proofing of sites. One of the things that came up for a number of the women that we spoke to was because of the location of the sites, often in kind of out of the way areas, old kipes near kind of pylons, and quite kind of wooded or with trees round about them. Given the issues of climate change and high winds and things like that, the women were saying that they were worried about actually what was going to happen in relation to that again, that they had raised issues about trees and about feeling unsafe and had been ignored. And one of the women saying that it's a health and safety issue too. The big tall trees, we're all frightened they'll fall down with the bad winds and fall on the trailers and kill somebody. It's happened before elsewhere within our communities, trees falling and killing people. So we asked about that kind of what plans had been made in relation to the future-proofing of sites, and also in relation to climate change, kind of net zero. And for the sites who have who have either redeveloped or under the way of redeveloping, they're saying that actually that's been considered within the work, and I believe that is one of the conditions that Scottish Government had around the provision of that funding. But for those other areas, there appears to have been no consideration about actually what are the specific needs for the Gypsy Traveller community in relation to climate change and net zero. So again, that's an area that we think needs to be considered. And just kind of, sorry, apologies, I know we're running out of time, but in terms of one of the things that came up time and time again in relation to this work was about that discrimination and stigma that all of the women that we spoke to talked about their experiencing, and about how it felt like for them that they were still a group that it was still okay for to be discriminated against, and that racism in relation to the Gypsy Traveller community was something they experienced regularly from people who worked for councils and other organisations, but also from the community generally. And that ties on to kind of experiences of children and young people within education. And we've got an example there, but there's a few examples within the report. And given that back in 2001, when the Equal Opportunities Committee reported back then, there was a recommendation that actually there was work needed to be done around racism and the experiences of Gypsy Traveller communities within education. Those issues are still prevalent today. And in fact, we, speaking to a few of the women, a number of the women who had children, there were real clear examples of that institutionally coerced exclusion, where because the issues weren't addressed, the children and the families excluded themselves from education, and the impact that then has. And the last bit that we, because as I say, as part of this research, we did speak to women who lived in, social housing. And as I say, that was for a variety of reasons. But one of the things that came across in relation to that was about the impact that living in homes had in terms of on individuals' mental health, but also on those feelings of isolation. And that guilt that often individuals, the women that we spoke to, felt, particularly in relation to their children, and their children not being able to experience that, that culture, that cultural upbringing that they had, was something that came across really strongly, and is something that needs to be considered. Now, the report has 16 recommendations within it. I've just got a couple there, and we've kind of highlighted a few of those as I've been going on through the presentation. But I think there really is something about the minimum site standards and how those are assessed, about the indicators that the housing regulator has, and about the way in which that participation or consultation is done with the community, and how that it looks like, what that looks like. Was one of the things, I think, when you look at the information that we gathered from the women that we spoke to, from the Freedom of Information requests, but also that desk research, is that I think this area of work really highlights the impact that we, as I say, of the outcomes and the reports and the action plans that we produce, if they are not, if they don't make their way into the budgetary process, how that stymies any kind of improvement for the individuals that are affected by that. So I will end it there, Carmen.
Thank you very much, Heather. Just a reminder, if people want to get in touch, those are the best contact email addresses. I'm going to attempt to stop the recording because I realized